Every day men announce that they're riding off in search of the truth in their particular area of interest, not realizing that therein they are the truth. Often when he'd hear the whirling of some meaningless machinery, this one man would stick his finger in it. He did this for many years before realizing it. For a long time in the back of his mind, one man thought of the secret. Then for some time he seemed to more or less forget about it. But then he'd start thinking about it again, and on like that. Once upon a time lived a man in whom arose the ability to severely despise, and on like that. In a land far away was a prince who attempted to establish a knightly order based on the precept, and so it goes, but only attracted recruits who were dedicated stay-at-homers. A certain obscure legend has it that life once tossed the secret out into the middle of a crowd, but them being a crowd and all, no one noticed it. I say, bad luck, old darlings. In one land were complex creatures with multiple abilities who consumed food they believed specifically nourishing for their heads, but it had a questionable characteristic. It was real sticky. Since within a species physical individuality is not feasible, men developed fashion, and in a similar vein mentally, collective thinking. No building is complete until it is inhabited. Neither is any defaced. The uniqueness of living in a four-dimensional area is that all streets, even one-way ones, run in both directions. You might further note that this is why only man and no animals can tolerate living in cities. There was once a race who refined their maps from the level of ink and paper to that of electro and chemical. Maxim correction. The phrase, life giveth and life taketh away, contains at least 5 superfluous words. Many a person remains enthralled with the idea of knowing the secret, yet something seems to subtly suggest to them that actually knowing it might not be as much fun as just thinking about knowing it. Pop quiz. How can you tell the difference between a mythical knight who knows the secret and just a routine crazy person? A knight would be the one wearing that metal suit and riding a horse, probably. To some, the world's most useless piece of machinery is collective thinking. As a child, he looked at pictures of naked bodies. Then, as an adult, searched for photos of stripped minds, and thus read headlong into the local limitations of neural pornography. On the 5th day of Christmas, the kid asked, "Can I open my consciousness now?" On one world was a travel agency known by the name of "Go Now, you don't even have to think about it, we'll do it for you." And everyone on that world received unlimited free travel, whether they wanted it or not. That should have read, everyone on that world received unlimited faux travel. One day in the enriched forest, the animals were sitting around talking and decided to take a vote as to what was the most foolish thing men do, at least from their view, and the victor was talk. They then voted as to what was man's greatest glory, and again, talk won. When the juice first hit the goo in the land of man's mind, he initially took the resulting sounds to be the voices of external supernatural forces. Many times since has he attempted to revise and improve this explanation, but with little to show for it. There was once a city with many fine residential structures, but wherein the inhabitants understood little of plumbing, heating, wiring, and general principles of construction and maintenance. A lad once again sought the counsel of the variant oracle and said to her, "Long ago did you give me the charge to know myself, but after many years in this effort I find it has brought me naught. What say ye to this?" And the muse could only chuckle to herself to see how little things change in 2,000 years. There was once two hunters. One was successful and one was not. One looked in the right places and the other one did not. I say, more bad luck, eh, what? The knights of one order invented games of sport to fill up the time they weren't physically on the quest. This worked so well that they invented reading and discussing to fill up the time they weren't intellectually on it. And damn if this didn't go so good that some of them decided to chunk the whole actual affair and just hang around the castle shooting hoops and a-dreaming. Only he who is the ruler of his own kingdom has the power to hang himself when necessary in his own best interest. Time for a wrap-up family portrait. One brother, you'll recall, wore glasses till his eyes were shot, while another used crutches till he went lame, and yet another wore a hearing aid for so long that he eventually became deaf. Now, did we leave anyone out? Oh, that's right. Smile and say, cheese. Query, what can you say about a species that will chew off its own foot even when in no visible trout? If you do not find your own mind to be a bottomless fount of creativity, you have not yet found your own mind. And yet another galaxy was once a planet whereon some creatures evolved an intellect but never the ability to speak. They did eventually develop their solar system's strongest hand and finger muscles in that they damn near signed themselves to death. Down, boy. Without ever physically leaving his chair, this one man could take a vacation any time he wanted to. And though this may at first sound like a desirable ability, he ultimately came to despise it. In a reality of additional dimensions, men's memory runs forward and backward. And thus they give not a damn when yesterday jams into tomorrow. As a game for those awaiting a plane, you could, where it refers to time in the above, substitute the notion of thought. Just as there is no cure for head-on train collisions, neither can conflicting opinions, competing ignorances, nor diverse realities be reconciled in the space available within a closed system. Numerology update. Yes, there is magic in numbers, but not in any of those you hear about locally. Thought limited is no thought at all. As regards the metaphorical, mystical Orient Express, Istanbul is certainly a totally different place than Paris, but so again is actually personally being on the way there, distinct from sitting in Paris thinking about the journey. Though travel is one thing and arrival another, either one is superior to staying home. Update regarding routine cranial management, that is to say, management of routine cranials. Only mouths can shut up, not minds. If, as so many continue to claim, man is the poison of humanity, then he is also the antidote. Yeah, but that's no fun to hear for a two-eared creature. Those in the middle of a parade have no idea where it's headed, nor how long it is. One man somehow got free of the collective area and got up on a mountaintop and looked down for the first time on his own home city and was instantly struck. Oh my God, I hadn't the faintest idea. For some time did one man lay in a coma, but who was to tell, since he didn't move or anything. Warning update. One's consciousness is nothing to play around with. unless you've used up everything else. If the great mystical quest does actually exist, it must do so in two forms. The first would be in thinking and talking about it, and the second in trying to undertake it. But damn, as little sense as the first one makes, just imagine how weird would be the other. Yeah, but over in this other solar system, some beings who've come to the finding that life just uses local weird conditions as a smokescreen to keep the secret from the simple and unprepared. Lexicology update. In the vocabulary of those who know are blanks, wherein would normally be attempted descriptions of the indescribable. Pop quiz number 2. What's the distinction between a mystic hitting a stupid spot and an ordinary person doing so? That one's almost too obvious and easy to even answer, right? When one wolf couldn't take physical control of the pack, he put on a skirt and claimed to be its spiritual leader. But them being old dumb animals and all, they wouldn't buy it. One man would sometimes say, if you're going to stay home a lot, at least have a friend there. Then began to wonder if it were not the fact of having a so-called friend there that made staying home seem so attractive. I say bad show to anyone with the audacity to think of one's home as a metaphor for one's thinking processes. Bad show. On this one world, all members of this one species were born with a certain illness. But understand, this being a natural part of their birthright, there was no cure for said ill, other than bitching and whining, which is actually more in the form of treatment. But the weak look to politics, the frightened to religion, the simple to psychology, the befuddled to philosophy. Did we leave anyone out? I certainly hope so. The king cautioned the neophyte knights just before they began to ride off. Along the way, never accept help from anyone who offers it. On one world was this real horrible monster that made everyone confused, messed up all their plans, and eventually ate them up. And the worst thing was that it was a piece of machinery. For many years, one man struggled to strengthen his memory and attention, and he finally succeeded, and then wondered, why? Pop quiz number 3. How can you spot the difference between a real mystic hearing an unpleasant story and a normal crazy person hearing the same one? The mystic wouldn't let on that it was in any way unpleasant. There was once a man who had a little pet that he cherished and nourished by mistreating in a certain little way. Remember, contestants, if you reach the goal and have to ask why, you haven't actually gotten there yet. And one man said, don't you just love this kind of extraordinary travel, the kind where you never seem to get there? Yeah. Until a man finally realizes that it takes no effort at all to live an ordinary, everyday, normal life, he knows nothing worth knowing. If the mind is an ocean, then thoughts carry some men while sinking others. Tip: never swallow anything that might lodge in your head. A comparisons update. If stock car racing is to Mozart as tennis is to Von Suppe, then of what the hell use are comparisons anyway? There was once a kingdom whose creatures could all count to 2, and who dreamed of rewards in a future life as being able to go up to 3. Problem was, based on their present outlook, they couldn't ascertain who, between themselves, would ultimately deserve such a prize. If Mozart drives the Talladega 500 and Von Suppe hangs around Wimbledon, then why can't a dude sharp as you think beyond the confines of comparisons? When you're used to noise, silence holds no charm. A man who cannot go everywhere necessary in his own mind wastes his time traveling. A pointing hint, number 12. Operation is to the secret as structure is to the search for it. In life, there's always a trillion things happening all at once, all over the place. And when it's specifically pointed out, man can realize this. But the rest of the time, their minds act as though the only thing occurring of note is whatever it is momentarily, sequentially focused on. The properly outfitted knight can ride off in any direction he chooses. Cliche update. Those who do not remember the past are free to forget about it. And now a final tip. And a final tip. Never swallow anything that may lodge anywhere. It is easy enough to put the knock on talk when it comes to stuff like this. It has been done for a long time, and last time we were meeting here, there was even a news item that pointed out the story regarding one mystical school that had two entrances, one saying, let's talk about it, and the other one saying, let's do it. And it said that you could not get into the second without first going into the first, but once you went into the first, you had a dickens of a time ever getting out. And everyone seemed to, that was here at that time, seemed to get a chuckle out of that. And there have been people throughout history making great fun of even attempting philosophical hectoring about excessive talk having to do with matters extraordinary. But I can also assure you if that becomes a person's, which is all you hear publicly, but when that becomes a person or some group of people, some apparent system, when that becomes their raison d'etre, to simply continually attempt to dissuade people from talk, and exert their greatest efforts, if not all their efforts, in attacking talk as opposed to actually doing something. When that becomes a system itself, I simply assure you, you should be able to hear yourself, that they do not know what they're talking about. It is just then part of the collective thought of man, even into the areas such as this, that lay claim to having some extraordinary potential. And there was another news item, if you might recall, the difference between, didn't have this preface, but the distinction between talking about doing such as this and the effort. In a slightly different way, you can point out that in this kind of activity, the efforts can be measured, or are measured in lifetimes, and the achievements in minutes. It is like one tonight I slipped in that pointed out that even though taking my mythical Orient Express as a metaphor, that there is an absolute difference between the state of Istanbul itself, and Paris. There's an absolute difference. So we're talking about the difference between the struggle to go from one place to another and the actual so-called arrival there, or the achievement of the effort. That Istanbul is absolutely distinct from Paris. But in a similar vein, any effort to make the journey is superior and distinct from simply sitting in Paris, talking and dreaming about it. So when you realize, or I'm saying it, that the efforts, so-called efforts having to do with the mystical quest or the search for the Holy Grail, the attempt to achieve an enlightenment, that the effort itself is easily measured in lifetimes, whereas anything resembling success is measured, I'll make you feel better, in hours instead of minutes. This is no real secret, but it's not normally taken into account. It is either, as I said, there will be people who will take it upon themselves who have not tasted much of Istanbul, if any, will take it upon themselves to run a crusade against palaver regarding the great quest. But look at it another way. Assuming, now let me put it to you. I'll start off with assuming, then I'll get quickly more specific. Assuming that it is a problematic of a person reaching the so-called state of enlightenment and remaining there indefinitely. And if it is not, I start off suggesting or assuming, but even if it were not problematic, even if I know better, I'll put it to you this way. Those in such a state are not tuning in, listening to this. They're not sitting here listening to this. And anyone in that state certainly, at that time, would not be conducting such as this. So if people do reach the state, if the Buddhas reach a Buddhahood, speaking metaphorically, and stay there, about those particular ones you hear no more. But notice in all the stories of the Jesuses reaching some Christ consciousness of Buddha, finally reaching enlightenment or Buddhahood, they all have some story, or after the fact, their followers come up with some story, such as with the Buddha. One of the great, probably the most specifically put, about that those who have reached enlightenment, they classify them, but it constitutes the majority of those who have ever tasted enlightenment. The Buddhists like to say that a certain type of Buddhists, a certain type of those who have tasted enlightenment, constituting again the majority, return back to their normal state and they claim that they have taken as their example the original Buddha, that is the original state of enlightenment, of some kind of a new state of consciousness. But to make it personal, personified, they say that they're taking their lesson from Buddha, that even though he reached a state of enlightenment and could have stayed there and was no longer suffering the ills of ordinary consciousness, that he had escaped the wheel of destiny and etc., that he was in another state of consciousness, but then came back willfully, returned back to something resembling a normal state and decided to stay there, teaching his lesson, what he had learned, and would not return permanently to that state of enlightenment until all other sentient creatures had reached this state. Which is another way of saying that Jesus, for instance, they're in all stories, but in all these major religious myths, the story of Jesus, even though he died, that all of his supposed messages, that even though he may have physically died, he had his spirit, the Holy Spirit of, that is another state of consciousness, would not leave those, his disciples, leave those who were interested in it, and so he was still there. But, as I said, just for the sake of carrying this on, what I was going to point out to you, you don't have to take it as an assumption. If someone reaches that state of an absolute, this other state of consciousness, an Istanbul state, and if it is possible, if it occurs, and I'm not saying one way or the other, but if it did and someone stays there, it is absolutely of no concern to anyone not there, because you never hear of them. There is no message coming back. That is the original paradigm for cosmology's notion now of a black hole. Whatever went in, nothing comes back out. They are gone. So, you're left with, under all ordinary conditions, you're left with the fact that you're always somewhere between Paris, well, the majority of your life, you can expect that you spend somewhere between Paris and Istanbul running that damn train as hard as you can, you think. Helping push, walking up and down the aisle, going woo-woo out the window, doing anything you want to do. You're talking about, you're measuring, if we want to take it to a more personal lifetime spectrum, then you have to measure your time in Istanbul, your time on the train in decades, and your actual time in Istanbul in minutes. So, doing the best you can, you're faced with this. You've got to do something in between. Again, this is known, besides just the stories of, whether you knew it or not, but the one about Buddha being right on the closest to right on the verbal money, the simplest of saying that the Buddhas, taking their lead from the original Buddha, that once they reached the state of enlightenment, realized what freedom was about. If you recall his version of it, supposedly that he realizes all life is suffering, which is to say an ordinary state of consciousness, because all ordinary people, including you at your ordinary level, you can see that more or less life is a bitch. And life is just not what it was cracked up to be. Life is not what you thought it was when you were 5 or 6 years old. Life is just, he just kind of, you might say, blew it. He engaged in a certain kind of hyperbole to say that he looked upon life after he once got enlightened and realized suffering. All is suffering, and everyone is trying to escape from suffering. There's supposedly different words in other languages, but we normally translate into English as suffering. I just normally refer to it as intellectually everyone is dissatisfied. That you itch somewhere, if you're sane and ordinary, you itch somewhere and you cannot really scratch it. And it's, with most people, you survive it. It's only those that the so-called mystics who seriously get involved with trying to scratch, trying to find the damn place and do something about it. Everyone else, you can get through. Everybody else does. It's not going to kill you. But there seems to be a kind of dissatisfaction, a kind of suffering, and Buddha said that once he got there, or the people after him said that he said it, as you know, that once he got free from that state, that he was no longer internally suffering. And then you've got to certainly free yourself from the more simplistic view of what suffering is, of being aged and sick and dying, because Buddha and everyone else gets sick and you age and you die. That's it. So you're not going to be free from that. Then you have to jump from the idea of suffering, even in the English translation of the word, from that kind of suffering to the dissatisfaction, the discomfort, the dissatisfaction of your level of consciousness. And so once he got free from that and understood, now I'll show you. And the verbal reports of his story are close enough without me having to rewrite them. And he went into a lot of detail, which it takes to capture people's minds. You come up with what appears to be a system, or again, at least his followers did, because that's the only way you can ever turn this into any public commodity. This is the only way that ordinary minds will ever take any interest in it. It seems to have some form to it. It seems to have an outline. You've got 4 or 5 steps. You've got 10 commandments. You've got 12 things to do. That's the only way, because then, even if you never leave Paris, you can at least feel like you're doing something. It would be like a traveler, and I'm not just making fun of it, which is easy enough again to do, of would-be weekend mystics, weekend warriors, people who believe in their incidents such as this, and they get books on mysticism, or they go join some weekend cult somewhere, they go meditate periodically. That's like sitting in the bus station or in the train station in Paris, or maybe even getting out and sitting on a train. And you sit there, and it never leaves, you never actually go anywhere, but you can sit there with an itinerary. This is always, that's part of man's, why animals, in my other news story, decided what was one of the most foolish things people do. In my version tonight, I put talk, the same thing as think, and then they also voted that that was man's greatest glory. It was the same thing. And so you can, having an intellect, you can decide that you want to go to Istanbul. You can decide that you want to do something once you hear the idea of being able to alter consciousness, or that's been done, and you think, yes, that's where I'm itching. And even if you believe that you have gotten on a train, or at least you've bought enough books, spent enough money reading about the mystical journey, that by God you deserve something. If there's any justice in the world, the gods and fates will shine down on you that you spent several $1,000s over the last 20 years on goddamn books. It's got to count for something. And so there you can sit on the platform in Paris, and even if you never go on a train, you never leave, you can sit there and you got this list like of things to do, books to read, things to think about, and you can check them off. And you can sit there the rest of your life and kill the time, fill up the time. But the idea, again, that a state of being a true Christian, a Jew, a Muslim, of actually being in some other state of consciousness, even at the simplistic levels as reported unknowingly by religion, their version of it comes out that no one can be a Christian since Christ, no one can be a real Jew since Abraham, no one can be a real Muslim since Muhammad. What they're trying to say without knowing it, what is being reflected in that speech is, it's not simply that you can't be a Christian, that you could not be as conscious in the same way that a Jesus was, but it's that you cannot stay there. They don't know how to put it, but it is a fair message. It is not untoward and it is not off the money. And so then you're faced with the fact that even if you have some ability, even if you have traveled, let us say, somewhere within spitting or smelling distance of Istanbul, or if you've actually been there, then we can say either sad to say or pleasurable to say, according to I'll leave it to you, those of you that's had a good taste of it. No matter what you do, you suddenly find that you're like that frog in the Budweiser commercial. Or it's like you're on an invisible, laterally sprung bungee cord that within a period of time, less than several days, you find yourself some way. You just see it happening. Is then you understand that some of the things I bring about memory being able to run forward and backwards, and that time does not run necessarily in a sequential way. I know that to ordinary minds that could sound like some kind of cheap-shotted sci-fi balderdash, but when you are at a different level, you can, in a sense, feel it slipping away, and you can see yourself going backwards on the track back toward Paris, and there's not a damn thing you can do about it because you're still alive. You're still breathing, not only local air, but you're still inhaling local impressions. You're still inhaling the local intellectual food. Because to stay in that condition, you end up, wasn't going into that, but you've almost got to be able to grow your own nourishment without any soil, without any proper soil. You just almost have to do the impossible. You have to quit engaging in cannibalism of the collective thinking of man. In some way, you've got to finally become creative. You have to do something original, and there's no way to explain it because in a closed system, how can you come up with your own original food? It's not possible. I understand that, so we won't get into it and make me look like a damn fool. So you've got to do something between time. And this has been reflected, as I said, the Buddha story about that real Buddhas, people who have really achieved enlightenment, most of them choose not to stay there, but they return back to the same level as humanity and have put off. No, I could stay in Istanbul and live there in peace and bliss forever, but I have not. I'll come back to Paris and somewhere along the way, and I will not go back there and stay there until all creatures have reached enlightenment, which is, that's about as safe a statement as a man can make. You have just about secured your future. That's better than nailing it down with 200 or 300 machine guns. But also this idea that a man must do something, and now I'm talking about people who aspire from just the least to those actually engaged actively in some sort of mystical quest. But they realize that they've got to be doing something, and this is outside the ordinary realm. As I said, all the way from the weakest to those most actively involved. You've got stories all the way, it's reflected in tales in the religious sense of those watching for the coming of the Messiah. And we got that in Judaism, you got it in Islam, you got it in Christianity, the way it's translated normally, that you're waiting for the Savior. In a sense, you're waiting for Istanbul to come get you. But you're waiting for it's the watching for the coming of the Messiah. You got that in the religious sense, and you've got it over into the profane world, the waitings for Godot's, that without any particular sacred connotation, but you've got stories. That was just bringing us into the 20th century, but you've got throughout the literature of the East and the West stories of people standing around waiting for something without any particular religious context to it, of not just a deliverance in a supernatural sense, but an awaiting for something extraordinary to happen. And I guess the Godot story is fairly representative of the 20th century notion or feel toward it, that no one's quite sure who Godot is, what he's going to bring, what's the purpose of him coming, why they're waiting, but hey, there you are. And that was it. So you've got all of that. Now, another way to look at it is to fill in the time. And I pointed out in the news item tonight that there was once a nightly order that I made up who invented games of sport to fill in the time in which they were not physically involved with the great quest, that they were not physically doing it. And it went so well that they then invented reading and discussing to fill up the time in which they individually weren't intellectually involved. And that went so damn good that some of them just decided to chunk their interest in the whole actual affair, and they just hung around home, that is a castle, a shooting hoops, and a daydreaming. But the first part of it was to be tied down to what I'm mentioning now, that to fill in this time you could look at as trying to do it through action or do it through thought. And these are reflected again, if you see on the wide screen of collective history, collective thinking, you can see the physical exploits, the actual adventures of a Moses, a Muhammad, the Moses representing the actual physical travel from one place to another, the seeking to be released from a certain kind of bondage, which you simply look at as Egypt in that case being an ordinary state of literal consciousness, to some higher state, to a promised land. And look at Muhammad with the idea of the holy jihad, of fighting, actual physical combat against lower consciousness, against everyday awareness, to try and bring people, anyway, the physical adventures, you could see, you could look at that as being the world of action, to fill in the time, the world of movement, and then look at the other side as being, is represented by the stories of the contemplative life of a Buddha, that he seemed to be more involved with, I will sit around and think. If you look at it this way, that here you are, let's assume, when I say you, that we have a person that has enough either experience, enough taste, enough personal success of some kind in this kind of activity. Either that, I was going to say that they've had enough to where they're irreversible now in their folly. It's either that or some people are just irreversible in their folly, regardless of there being any demonstrative experience in tasting it. It's just that there are people, which constitutes the heart of whatever would be the mystical body on this planet at any time, the unorganized group of people with that kind of severe itch that they have not abandoned, that it's just, in many cases, just on the basis that they could be 50 or 60 years old, and if you found them and said, well, do you understand whatever term they were using? Do you think you have ever awakened your own consciousness? Have you ever liberated your own mind? Have you ever reached that state of enlightenment as you understand it? And they'd go, no, as far as I'm concerned, I have not. And then if you ask them a little more, like, well, do you feel like you've wasted your time? I mean, well, why didn't you stop? And that would be about having in mind the kind of good picture of the person I'm describing or that I have in mind. And if you say, well, are you upset that you spent 50 years? That you say you started doing it when? You guys go, well, about as long as I can remember, I was interested, but I've been actually out doing things as much as possible since I was 15 or 16. And so you've been doing it 35 or 40 years. And yeah. And you haven't reached it. And you go, well, no, not as far as I'm concerned. You go, well, are you irritated? Don't you feel like you wasted your life? And again, if he gave it, you give him credit, the best response to you, an interested inquirer, it would be, in other words, he would not say yea nor nay. He certainly would not denounce it because he got no choice. Now, I don't mean just in the ordinary sense that he would feel foolish that he had wasted 60 years or 40 years and that now he cannot deny his urban folly, because a man would not look at it as folly. This kind of shrug, as I intended to convey, that he meant I had no choice. I still had no choice. You know, I started running this race, as the Christians used to call it, or I started riding this train, as I turned the mystical, the Orient Express into, that I am now on this train, and you know, no matter what happens, I'm not getting off. There's nothing to talk about. And I'm not going to start speculating about, well, aren't you sorry you did it, or maybe you should have gotten on another train, or maybe you got on the train at the wrong station, maybe you got on the train at the wrong time. You know, maybe. And he wouldn't even speculate on it, because he understands it's useless. I had no choice. But in the matter of action, to say that a person could do something to fill up the time that you've got to, it's either that or you're going to drift. I pulled out several if you didn't know why I pulled them out. When you're used to noise, silence holds no charm. If the mind is an ocean, then thoughts carry some while sinking others. If you do not find your own mind to be a bottomless fount of creativity, then you have not yet found your own mind. And every day, men announce they're riding off in search of the truth in the particular area that interests them, not realizing that therein, that is the area that interests them, they are the truth. They are what they're searching for. They represent it in action, in operation, not in structure. They represent it in verbs, not in nouns. They represent it in function, not in construction. But you've got two possibilities, as always with man, the thinking creature. To fill up the time, and I do not mean that in a pejorative sense, but there you are on the train, and you're not sure how to make it go any faster. You know that you're going to keep riding it, and you know that times, without any doubt, you're closer to Istanbul, even if you've never seen it. You know that there are times, without any question, without any sort of external standards or measurements available, you simply know non-verbally that you're in a better state of consciousness, and you understand, yes, yes, yes. And it's either there for a few seconds, a few minutes, or it seems to go on spasmodically every few seconds or every few minutes for 12 hours, and then it's gone. But you have no doubt that there are times that you're simply closer to it, and there's nothing to be said. Then the times that you cannot seem to do it, the times that you seem to be laying there in a coma. Although you may be walking around, you may be driving a stock car. You may be flying down the freeway at 90 miles an hour. You may be in a courtroom representing a client as an attorney. You may be before the IRS representing someone as in the form of being an accountant. You may be teaching a class in philosophy or mathematics. You may be engaged in what would appear to be quite intricate and complex intellectual affairs, and yet any good mystic, anyone who's ever been on this train for any length of time, knows that you can do that in a coma. They know that you know that ordinarily you do that in a coma. The only difference between you and a man laying there in a coma is you're standing up in a coma, which is fine. That news item, if some of you didn't get it, that said that one man lay for a long time in a coma, but you know who was to tell? Because he didn't move or anything. See, they couldn't tell because he didn't move, and so you can't say, well, I guess he's in a coma, but you can't prove it. It gets, do your own, it kind of gets tricky. The only way, it takes a person who has been out of a coma for a while to realize that, yes, I just got through delivering this great lecture. I fielded questions. I signed autographs. I did all sorts of intricate things. I engaged in a personal, intimate conversation with somebody that came up. Then later on the way home, I realized, well, I was back in a coma for the last 2 hours. And yet I got a standing ovation. I succeeded. I made another $200,000 off that deal. I scrutinized their contract. I asked very piercing questions. I called what they were trying to do, get me to sign that. And I said, no, call in. We're going to have to change that. I went through all of that, smiled, felt like I had really succeeded. They even looked at me like, there's no pulling the wool over your eyes. You're sharper than we thought. And now you are driving home realizing, well, I did all of that in a damn coma. I might as well have been unconscious compared to what I know I can be. So a man knows that. Until you know that, I know when I slipped in tonight, just a variation of the same old one, that until a man knows that he can live everyday, normal, routine, even successful life without any effort, until you know that, you don't really know anything worth knowing. Because everyone else, including you, will bitch and whine. You think that things are going somewhere, and you wonder why. Sometimes you succeed and sometimes you don't, and all of that. But until you realize that all of that might as well have been done in a coma, and that what you call making effort wasn't making effort. It was just pains you had laying there in a coma or staying there in a coma. That there was nothing extraordinary about it. It was not based upon the efforts you were making. Until you understand that you can live, you could be elected Pope, President, Prime Minister, make a fortune, be successful, be famous, and do it all with no effort. And of course, conversely, be poor as hell, homeless, broke, sick, hunched over, full of self-pity. You can do them both, and they take no effort. Or for those of you like another weight, they take equal amounts of effort. Until you know that, you don't know anything worth knowing. So then you're left with, what can I do? And what I was going to point out was not just specifically now, what can I do in the sense of what other sorts of potentially mystical or enlightening rituals, disciplines, tricks I might specifically do. It's just, I was presenting the question in a wider rhetorical form of what can I do, you would ask yourself, that I'm faced now with another 40 or 50 years of sitting here on this train. There's no doubt I'm going to stay on it. I'm going to do my damnedest. Something terrible is going to happen to get me off. I'm going to have to fall into a bigger coma than I have ever experienced. But I'm going to be here, and just in general, over a wide scope, what am I going to do sitting here on this train, even after I make, at times, what I consider to be at least timely and potentially useful methods, such as get up against the bulkhead of the train car I'm in and push against it. Hell, give it a try. It might make the train go faster. The point is, you're going to be doing something. But in general, without any specifics, the question, the rhetorical question I was presenting is, what are you going to do? You're going to have to do something, and you've got the choice first to consider, do something requiring action, which then you're ending up, by and large, almost entirely with trying to undertake some specific discipline, some ritual to take up sitting, take up some form of movement, like the metaphorical use of martial arts, or you could take up whirling, dancing. But if you're not taking up something specific, then the question is, how will I spend my time, and then either in thinking or in action? Now in action, I was going to get into thinking tonight because action is fairly limited about the best you can say, about the most useful to say, besides the specifics. And not saying that you can't use some specific so-called discipline or something that seems to be tied, or that you perceive to be tied, or that you can use that can be, at least metaphorically, tied to the struggle itself, to the quest. But other than that, the rest of the time is the greatest, or the best direction to give is for a person to pursue that which they seem to be talented in, that they seem to have, which is synonymous with interest if you're sane. That if you're interested in music, if you're interested in dance, painting, literate writing, is to pursue it. But that kind of pursuit, again, I'll point out, varies if you're doing it with at least the background of an interest still in the great quest. You're doing it for your own reasons and not for an audience. Not that there's anything improper, ungodly about an audience, but the difference being, if you're pursuing something, the acid test is easy. If you're pursuing something and it's based primarily, as close as would be usefully possible to measure it, it's based primarily upon your own interest and not simply that of wanting to dance with the public, that is, seeking approval of some other wolves, some other cows in a herd, is it is the kind of activity that can be done with no audience. That you can sit around and write a poem, if it was that, or write music, paint, sculpt, And it's not to say that no one might never see it, but that is not the benchmark of it. It is not dependent. You can write a verse, you can write a short story, you can paint, and you get as much pleasure when you do it to please you, that the reward is sufficient, that you do not require that someone come in off the street, individual or collectively, to come over and approve of it. You can simply do it alone. That would be all I was going to mention about the world of action insofar as what to do to fill up the time. Because it all has to do, again, if it's not having to do specifically with some so-called mystical discipline, then it would be pursuing that which personally pleases you and requires no audience reaction. Whether you ever do it publicly or not is not the point. That if you do not, though, is that the time that you're filling by pursuing your own artistic, creative interest, that you can do it and the pleasure is adequate alone. Sitting in your room, writing a song, and it gets just right. Painting a picture, sketching, whatever it is, and it gets just right, and you can stop, and you are pleased. The area that I was going to speak of, since I spent 2 minutes on that, we've got about 3 to spend now on this, is what to do intellectually, because it would seem more apropos and more pertinent to be speaking of what to do with the mind rather than the body, because it is in the non-physical world that consciousness is at its best. It is, in fact, the only place that you can verbally, rationally speak about consciousness is to speak of it antipodal to physical activity or to the body, although it's not separate, but you have to speak of it for it to make any usable sense. Even rhetorically, you have to speak about it as being a different domain. And so it would seem to be that if you're going to speak about spending the time on the voyage from Panama City to Utopia, or from Cleveland to Shangri-La, or from Paris to Istanbul to another state of consciousness, that it would seem at first that the area most worthy of consideration would be in the world of thought, what to do with the mind as opposed to the body. Because one thing, you can do something, the mind's going on whether you're doing anything with the body or not, whereas the reverse is not necessarily true. And so you could be painting, you could be out jogging, if it got to be that your field of particular interest was just physical activity, the game of sport. And perhaps that would be that if you don't paint, you don't write, you have no interest in music, let us say that was just some physical athletic activity. While doing that, your mind's still going to be doing something, so you're always faced with what to do with the mind. They're obviously not infinite in a closed system, but there have been more attempts than I care to speculate, more than I'm damn sure about to count, of people attempting to say, here's what you should be doing with the mind. Even when it's in the guise, it's normally in religious context, but there have been more specific attempts under the general umbrella of mystery schools or mystical activity. But what I was going to point out tonight, without saying, which we've already covered many times, sideways and backwards, or off to the side, of things a person could do with the mind since they're going to be operating anyway. How about some things in the thought area not to do? Because everyone always likes that better, as witnessed by the fact that bad news is the only news that has an audience for, as I point out, quite physical reasons. But things not to do, not to spend the time, not to fill up the time sitting there on the train. If we got 3 minutes, I can give you 3 good ones, 1 a minute. Certain things not to do. Do not continue counting to 2 do not continue to play the same old game of jacks. And above all, do not stick your finger in meaningless pieces of machinery. If there had been a topic of tonight's sermon, it would have been right there on page number 2. Often when he'd hear the whirling of some meaningless machinery, this one man would stick his finger in it. He did this for many years before realizing it. Would anyone suspect, now that I brought it out in the context of things one might do in the world of thinking, that this has nothing to do with physically sticking your finger in a piece of machinery? What it has to do with is taking your awareness, your own consciousness, the only thing that you have of any potential value, and you stick it out there when you hear the whirling of meaningless machinery, and you stick it out there. You stick your finger right in it because it is almost irresistible. You're sitting there on the train. Metaphorically speaking, you've tried to wrap yourself, at least internally, to yourself in the garb of a mystic. You've tried to isolate yourself. You've tried to separate yourself from the mundane world of the other writers. Oh, take your best shot at it. And yet there you sit. And you hear the whirling of useless, meaningless machinery. Some people behind you say, did you read about Duchess so-and-so? She killed her husband last night, and that's turned out they've arrested her and found out she has been engaged in an illicit love affair with a chauffeur. And there you sit and you'll stick your finger right in it. It is not because there's anything objectively evil about gossip and etc., but it is. I was going to get around to doing it. We ran out to cover all the many attacks publicly throughout history on gossip and etc. I put it to you the way it should be put. When one man would hear the whirling of some meaningless machinery, they all have their sound, he would stick his finger in it. That is collective thinking. That is the extent of most people. That is the extent of 99% of this planet's population's intellectual activity. It is a cannibalistic form. Not only do you stick your finger, if you're an ordinary person, continually into meaningless whirling machinery, but then once you do it, you're expected to produce some equally sounds of whirling, meaningless machinery so that the other parties can go, and stick it in yours. It is the self-fueling, cannibalistic, so-called intellectual life of consciousness at the ordinary level. Don't count to 2. Don't keep playing the same old game of jacks. Maybe some of you women are going to have to explain to some of you macho men here that never played jacks. Quit playing the same old game of jacks. Up, down, bounce, bounce, pick them up, lay them down. And do not stick your finger in meaningless pieces of machinery. I could just isolate it and say that would be the one that covers it all. Do not stick your finger in useless and meaningless pieces of machinery, because if you stop that, if I had time to explain it more, I'm sorry, but if you understand it yourself, once you see it, then that covers everything. That if you lay aside and you can see sticking of one's finger in meaningless machinery, then what you're left with would be a benefit to fill in the time mentally on the ride. Then you don't have to be more specific. That's why I took the negative approach to start with, because if you can simply stop sticking your finger in meaningless pieces of machinery, then whatever's left is worthwhile. Then whatever's left is a useful filling in of the time between Paris and Istanbul. But never this. And always note, the way I put it to you, it always seems to start out there. You think you always hear something. It's the whirling. And it is, in the law they have a term for it. It's called a attractive nuisance. And the law forbids it. It's like having an empty swimming pool in your backyard that you never, in the wintertime, that you never cover, and you know that there are little nippers, little toddlers that live all around your neighborhood and your yard's not fenced in. You can be held responsible even though a little nipper, a little child comes over there and legally trespasses in your backyard. but it's known as an attractive nuisance that was so strong that they couldn't help it, and you're held responsible. That's the way, in a sense, that a proper traveler on that mystical Orient Express has got to look upon everything out in life. Not because it's evil, and we're not talking about the world of behavior now. We're not talking about the world of vice, of fleshly vices, of sex and booze and all that. We're talking about up here, that it's all an attractive nuisance. If it comes from out there, that you hear that whirling, and you're done for. I mean, you don't even have to stick your finger into it once you see it. You realize whatever it is, it's of no value. Or as us mystics like to say, it's bullshit.
Yeah.
Pertinent, I mean, necessary bullshit, but impertinent. It's meaningless. Is that all? That's all.